Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Vishal Kewali. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Oncology and Public Health Sciences in Queen's University, and I'm happy to talk about the concept of cancer groundshot, specifically as it relates to prioritization of cancer drugs in low and middle income countries. We all know that many people in low and middle income countries do not have access to many cancer drugs. And this is a balance between two issues. One is lack of availability, and the other is even if the drugs are available, many patients cannot afford it. So why is a cancer drug unavailable? One is simply due to the regulatory issues. There is lack of financial motivation for the company to apply for regulatory approval in different countries. And even if they do, there is regulatory inability to assess the value of new cancer drugs in several countries. And then there is the production issues, manufacturing issues, the issues with importing cancer drugs. It is shown that even in high-income countries, there is almost 1 to 2 years of lag to obtain the drug after regulatory approval. And this is all the more severe in low and middle-income countries. If we look at the WHO Essential Medicine list, which is one of the lists made by the WHO that recommends priority drugs to be included in the national formulary. So of that essential medicine list, if we look at cancer drugs, we see that something quite disappointing is happening. One is that of the 25 cancer drugs listed in the 2013 WHO list, all these 25 cancer drugs were available only in 17 of 135 countries that we studied. And if you look at low-income countries, then only 9 of them were available. And of the newer drugs that were included in the 2015 revision, the availability is quite poor. And here we are not talking about the new cancer drugs that are quite transformational, like immunotherapies. We are talking about classical old drugs that we have known for years, or drugs like cisplatin. Even drugs like cisplatin is available only in 72% countries, or drugs like oxaliplatin. These are classical old drugs, only in 36% of the countries. And newer, relatively newer drugs like Herceptin or erlotinib, they are available in less than 20% of the countries. The European Society for Medical Oncology did a big study on these issues surrounding cancer drugs, and they wanted to see what are the barriers to availability and accessibility of these cancer drugs. And they find that in high-income countries, mostly there are no barriers, but if you go towards the low-income countries, then no supplier or unreliable supplier is #1 barrier to not having these cancer drugs. The second most common reason is no commercial motive, and then there is manufacturing problems. So these are the commonest reasons why we don't have uniform access to these essential medicine list drugs. And then if we look at the issues of cost and availability, then again, usually in high-income countries, it's available for free for most of the patients. But if you go to low-income countries, mostly it's available by paying the full cost upfront from the pocket. And this leads to something that we refer to as financial toxicity. Financial toxicity is the detrimental effects not only in the patient but also in the society and the family due to the high cost of cancer drugs. And here we can see that this is a survey done in Nepal, a low-income country. We see that almost 3/4 of the patients, they had to ask money for charity from the public. They had to borrow loans from friends and relatives, paying as much as 36% interest, and they had to sell property like house, land, and livestock just to support chemotherapy treatment in leukemia. So what we are seeing here is that yes, modern cancer drugs, they are expensive, but low and middle income countries, they lack access or affordability to even old generic cancer drugs. It's not only about the modern cancer drugs. So what about the cost of cancer drugs? So the first question is, why are the cancer drugs so expensive? Is it due to high R&D costs? And are cancer drugs cheaper in low-income countries? So to get to the answer, one, cancer drugs cost much or high, not because of R&D costs. There are several studies showing that cancer drugs recoup their R&D costs several folds within the first 3 or 5 years of approval. And about cancer drugs being cheaper in low-income countries, yes, if we look at the absolute price, then the absolute price is low in low-income countries for the same drug as compared to high-income countries. But if we control that for the purchasing capacity, for the GDP, then it's quite unaffordable. Yes, patients in low-income countries pay less, absolutely, but they are paying more percentage of their annual income, so it's unaffordable. And this is the figure that shows when the cancer drugs, they recoup their R&D cost. And you can see here for several cancer drugs it was investigated, and we found the researchers found a median of $14.5 of return per dollar invested in R&D. But does access mean access to any cancer drug? When we are fighting for access, should we fight for access to any cancer drug? Or is it about access to meaningful cancer drugs? And this is the philosophy of cancer groundshot that I titled this talk about. This is a paper that we wrote in 2018 in Lancet. This is basically a principle of prioritization. Lack of access to new cancer drugs should not detract us from lack of access to meaningful cancer drugs, and lack of access to curative services like surgery or radiation. To give specific examples, lack of access to drugs like trastuzumab for breast cancer and immunotherapy for melanoma, it is an important need, but lack of access to drugs like regorafenib for colorectal cancer, that's not a big deal. Even if we don't have access to those marginal drugs, we don't need to lose sleep over it. But how do we prioritize? There are several ways in which we can prioritize it. We can assess the value of the cancer drugs, that's the magnitude of benefit and the relative cost, and based on the prevalence of the disease burden in the given country, and whether there are facilities to accurately measure the biomarkers that are needed to use these drugs, and whether there are resources to help manage toxicities. So how can we improve this? We discussed about the problem. How can we improve it? One is price transparency, because it has been shown that in studies, if there is significant price gap between the price paid by the highest priced country and the lowest priced country for the same cancer drug. So if there was transparency in the price, then probably the country that is paying more will negotiate. The other is universal health coverage. The problem with several LMICs is that they don't have a universal health coverage, and so the bargaining power is gone. Studies have consistently shown that if the government is paying with a universal health coverage, then the government actually pays far less for the drugs than when patients are paying individually. And the need for HTA, body and price regulation. We studied this in a paper comparing US versus Canada. As you know, in Canada we have a health technology assessment body, the CADAT, but US does not. And we showed that cancer drugs that go through our health technology assessment body, they are in general providing better magnitude of benefit, better value than cancer drugs that are approved in the US, because it does not have a health technology assessment body. And the other study showed that the launch price in the US was 42% higher compared to the launch price in UK. Again, UK has a health technology assessment body, but US does not. And there are several other steps like public-private partnerships. The imatinib project, the GIPAP project that distributed free Glivec or imatinib to several countries, has been an inspirational model of how public-private partnership can help transformational drugs reach patients globally. And then there is also the question of what's the responsibility of the industry and their corporate social responsibility to offer drugs for cheap or free to patients who are quite poor. And then there is the question of philanthropy, several philanthropic organizations, how they can contribute to this. But these are very minor steps. The bigger steps are about price transparency and HTA and universal health coverage. And one important elephant in the room is participation in clinical trials. Many people argue that if more and more clinical trials are opened in low-income countries, then several patients can have access to these new drugs. But there are a lot of challenges because not all trials are created equal. Can access to the new drug in low-income countries justify conducting a trial that would not have been considered ethical in high-income countries? This is a topic that we need to think more about because there have been studies like this which has shown that if low-income countries participate in a drug trial that finally gets approval in the United States by the FDA, then within 1 year, 0% of those low-income countries had access to the same drug. Within 5 years, only 22% had access to the same drug. So that means they just participated in a trial of a drug that turned out to be useful, but those countries never had access to it. So we should more focus on investing in meaningful clinical trials. If we take the example of COVID-19, then participating in a drug of remdesivir type drug, which provides marginal benefit at a high cost, is of no value to low-income countries. But participating in dexamethasone type trials, cheap drug affordable across the world and substantial benefit, that is a value. One other issue that can be discussed is about compulsory licensing and importing of generics. Because several countries, low-income countries, have now started to issue compulsory licensing for manufacturing generic of these expensive drugs. This is an example taken from countries like Thailand and India and Ecuador that issued compulsory licensing to several of these cancer drugs. And one benefit of this is even if the compulsory licensing is not granted, this can be used as a negotiating chip with the industry for lowering the prices. And this study showed that $140 million was saved by Thailand in 5 years for these three drugs alone, docetaxel, letrozole, and erlotinib, by issuing a compulsory license. And one other elephant in the room is the quality of drugs. There have been several concerns that some cancer drugs that are being manufactured in low and middle income countries may not be of optimal quality. And there was a survey saying that up to 12% of the patients in India, they consume counterfeit medications. So there should be some regulation to control this. Because having access to counterfeit medicines is worse than not having access, because you spend money for things that are probably worse than nothing. So in conclusion, access depends on availability and affordability, and we need a strong political will and international cooperation to ensure availability of essential cancer drugs. And there are several strategies, as we discussed, that can be enacted, and participation in meaningful Groundshot type clinical trials is important. And I think this is where advocacy from organizations like yours will be quite important to raise voice towards this inequality in access to even cheaper, older generic cancer drugs. Thank you. I'm happy to get any feedback and chat further about any of these issues that you may want. Thanks.